good evening. Tonight, we will tell the story of Icarus, the boy who dared to defy the very sky. He soared higher than anyone before, closer to the sun, tasting the freedom every human dreams of. But a flight that became a moment of triumph turned into tragedy. Ambition and youthful recklessness cost him his life. And in that fall lies an eternal reminder that reaching for the impossible sometimes comes at the highest price. In ancient Athens, when the Parthenon was still young and the city was the beating heart of Greek civilization, there lived a man whose skill with his hands was matched only by his brilliance of mind. His name was Daedalus, and he was the greatest inventor, architect, and craftsman of his age, perhaps of any age. When kings needed impossible things built, when impossible problems needed solving, when the boundary between the achievable and the fantastical needed to be crossed, they called upon Daedalus. He was descended from the royal house of Athens itself, tracing his lineage back to Erechtheus, one of the legendary kings. But Daedalus's true nobility lay not in his bloodline but in his genius. His hands could shape wood, stone, and metal into forms so lifelike they seemed ready to breathe. His mind could conceive of mechanisms and devices that others could barely comprehend. He had invented the saw, it was said, inspired by watching a snake's jawbone. He had created the first ship's mast and sail, revolutionizing maritime travel. His statues were so realistic that people swore they moved when no one was watching. But genius, as is so often the case, came paired with pride. Daedalus knew he was the best, and he expected others to acknowledge it. He took on apprentices, not out of generosity, but because even a master craftsman needed assistance for the more tedious aspects of his work. Among these apprentices was his nephew Talos, sometimes called Perdix in different versions of the story, a young man who showed disturbing signs of matching or even exceeding his uncle's talents. Talos was brilliant. At barely 12 years old, he had independently invented the compass and the potter's wheel. He looked at a fish skeleton and conceived of the idea for a saw, claiming later that his uncle had stolen the invention. Whether this was true or simply the boast of a confident youth, no one could say for certain. But what was clear was that Talos possessed the same innovative spark as Daedalus, the same ability to look at the world and see not what was, but what could be. Daedalus felt his pride stung. He had been the unquestioned master, the singular genius, and now this boy, his own nephew, was threatening to eclipse him. Perhaps in time, Talos would be remembered as the greater inventor. Perhaps Daedalus would become merely a footnote, the uncle of the truly brilliant Talos. This thought was intolerable. One day, while they were working together on the Acropolis, building or repairing one of the great temples that crowned Athens' sacred hill, Daedalus acted on his darkest impulse. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, he pushed his nephew off the edge. Talos fell from the height, his young body tumbling through the air toward the rocks below. Some versions of the story say that Athena, goddess of wisdom and crafts, took pity on the falling boy and transformed him into a partridge bird before he struck the ground. Others say he died on impact, his brilliant mind extinguished in an instant, his potential unrealized. But all versions agree on one thing. Daedalus had committed murder, driven by jealousy and pride to destroy the very talent he should have nurtured. The crime could not be hidden. Too many had seen them working together, noticed the boy's absence, and questioned what had happened. Daedalus was brought before the Areopagus, the council that judged homicide cases in Athens. He was found guilty of murder, of killing his own nephew out of jealousy and professional rivalry. The penalty was exile. Daedalus would be banished from Athens, forbidden to return on pain of death. He would lose his home, his workshop, his position at the heart of Greek civilization. Everything he had built would be stripped away, and he would have to start over somewhere else, carrying the stain of murder with him wherever he went. But Daedalus was not alone in his exile. With him went his son, Icarus. Icarus was young. The exact age varies in different tellings, but somewhere between boyhood and young manhood, that awkward age where one is no longer a child, but not yet fully an adult. He had grown up in his father's workshop, surrounded by inventions and projects, learning the crafts and skills that had made Daedalus famous. He worshipped his father, as sons often do, seeing in him not the jealous murderer, but the brilliant inventor, the man who could make the impossible real. The boy had no choice in exile. He had committed no crime, but he would share his father's punishment nonetheless. Together, father and son fled Athens, leaving behind everything familiar, searching for a place that would accept the infamous craftsman and his innocent child. They traveled south and east, across the Aegean Sea, until they came to Crete, the great island kingdom ruled by King Minos, a realm famous for its wealth, power, and labyrinthine complexity. And there, in the court of Minos, Daedalus found both refuge and a new kind of prison. King Minos of Crete was a powerful ruler with a terrible problem. His wife, Pasiphae, had given birth to a monster, the Minotaur, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. Born from a curse and a divine punishment too complicated and disturbing to fully recount, the Minotaur was savage, violent, and fed on human flesh. It could not be killed, or rather, Minos could not bring himself to kill it, for it was still, technically, his wife's child, his stepson. The solution Minos conceived required the greatest architect alive. He needed a structure that could contain the Minotaur, keep it imprisoned but alive, hidden from the world but accessible when necessary. He needed something so complex, so cunningly designed, that once you entered it, you could never find your way out. He needed a labyrinth, and for that, he needed Daedalus. The exiled craftsman accepted the commission. What choice did he have? He needed the king's protection, needed a place to practice his craft, needed a home for his son, and so, on the grounds of Minos' palace at Knossos, Daedalus designed and built the most famous architectural marvel of the ancient world. The labyrinth was a masterpiece of confusing design. It wasn't simply a maze. Any fool could build a maze. It was a three-dimensional puzzle of corridors that twisted back on themselves, staircases that led nowhere, doors that opened onto walls, passages that seemed to change depending on how you entered them. The ceiling was sometimes the floor. The exit might look like an entrance, and the path you had just walked down would somehow be different when you tried to retrace your steps. At its heart, in the deepest chamber, lived the Minotaur. And to that chamber, at regular intervals, Athens was forced to send a tribute of 7 young men and 7 young women, victims to be devoured by the beast, payment for a long-ago defeat in war. The tributes were led into the labyrinth, and the labyrinth ensured they never came out. Daedalus built it all. He constructed every confusing corridor, designed every impossible angle, crafted every disorienting feature. And when it was complete, King Minos was impressed beyond measure. The craftsman had created exactly what was needed: a prison that was also a death trap, a structure that captured the very concept of being lost and made it architectural. But Minos had a problem. Daedalus knew the secret of the labyrinth. He knew its paths, its tricks, its vulnerabilities. He knew how to navigate it, how to escape it, how to defeat its purpose. and as long as Daedalus lived and remained free, that knowledge was a threat to Minos' security. So Minos made a decision. He would keep Daedalus in Crete, not as an honored guest, but as a prisoner. Oh, the craftsman would have his workshop and his tools, would be allowed to continue his work. But he would never be permitted to leave the island. Guards were posted, ships were watched, and it was made clear Daedalus was as much a prisoner as the Minotaur, only his cage was larger and less obviously a cage. Icarus, of course, was trapped alongside his father. The boy had done nothing wrong, had never done anything wrong, in fact, unless you counted being the son of a murderer. But he was confined to Crete, just as surely as Daedalus was, his youth slipping away in a gilded prison. Years passed. Daedalus worked on projects for Minos, creating clever devices and beautiful sculptures, using his talents in service to the king who held him captive. He was treated well enough, given fine quarters, good food, respect for his abilities, but he was not free, and the knowledge gnawed at him constantly. He watched his son grow from a boy into a young man, watched Icarus's youth being consumed by this imprisonment. The boy should have been free to travel, to learn, to make his own way in the world. Instead, he was trapped on an island, his horizons limited to the shores of Crete, his future constrained by his father's past crimes. Daedalus's brilliant mind turned to the problem of escape. He studied the guards, analyzed the harbor patrols, examined every possible route off the island. But Minos was thorough. Every ship was searched, every passenger questioned, every cargo inspected. The king controlled the seas around Crete, absolutely. There was no way to escape by water. And then one day, watching birds soar overhead, free to come and go as they pleased, untouched by guards or walls or royal decrees, Daedalus had an idea. If they could not escape by land or sea, perhaps they could escape by air. It was impossible, of course. Humans could not fly. But Daedalus had built his career on making the impossible real. He began to plan their escape, and in doing so, he set in motion the events that would lead to his greatest achievement and his most terrible loss. The workshop where Daedalus planned their escape was in a tower overlooking the sea. It was a generous space, filled with the tools of his trade, mallets and chisels, saws and drills, sheets of bronze and blocks of marble. But now, instead of working on another sculpture for Minos, or another clever device for the palace, Daedalus devoted all his attention to a single obsessive project. Building wings, he started by studying birds. He watched them for hours from his window, gulls and eagles, sparrows and hawks, anything that flew. He observed how they angled their wings to catch the wind, how they adjusted their feathers to turn and dive, how they flapped to gain altitude and glided to conserve energy. He dissected dead birds he found or acquired, examining the structure of their wings, the arrangement of their feathers, the bones that supported them. Slowly, methodically, he began to understand the principles of flight. It wasn't magic or divine intervention. It was physics, mechanics. Design. A wing was essentially a tool for manipulating air, for creating lift and thrust. If he could replicate that tool on a human scale, if he could craft artificial wings that mimicked the structure and function of bird wings, then perhaps, just perhaps, they could fly. The construction took months. Daedalus collected feathers everywhere he could find them. From the palace grounds, from the beaches, from hunters and farmers. He needed thousands of them, in various sizes, from the tiny down feathers to the long primary feathers that provided thrust. Icarus helped, of course, gathering feathers enthusiastically. excited by his father's mysterious project, not yet understanding what it was for. The framework of the wings was made from thin wooden struts, carefully shaped and joined to mimic the skeletal structure of a bird's wing. The feathers were attached in precise arrangements, smaller feathers near the body for insulation and aerodynamics, medium feathers for the main surface, long feathers at the edges for control and power. And to hold it all together, Daedalus used wax. Not ordinary candle wax, but a careful mixture of beeswax and other compounds, something with the right flexibility and adhesive properties. The wax would hold the feathers to the wooden frame, would seal and smooth the wing surface, would, hopefully, be strong enough to withstand the stresses of flight. But wax had a weakness, and Daedalus knew it. It would melt if exposed to too much heat. The sun, particularly the Mediterranean sun at its height, was hot enough to soften and eventually melt wax. It was a vulnerability, but every solution has trade-offs, and wax was the best option available given their resources and constraints. As the wings took shape, Daedalus finally told Icarus the truth about what they were building. They were going to escape, he explained. They were going to fly off this island like the birds, soar over the guards and the harbors and the king's navy, and find freedom somewhere far from Minos's reach. Icarus was thrilled. Flight, the ultimate impossibility, the dream of every child who had ever watched a bird and wondered what it would be like to soar above the earth. His father, the great inventor, was going to make it real. They would fly together, father and son, escaping their prison through the very sky itself. But Daedalus was more measured in his excitement. He understood better than his young son just how dangerous this would be. They would be attempting something no human had ever done, using equipment that had never been tested, betting their lives on his calculations and craftsmanship. One mistake, one flaw in the design, one misjudgment about wind or weight or wing surface area, and they would fall from the sky to their deaths. He built 2 pairs of wings, a larger set for himself and a smaller set for Icarus. He made harnesses that would strap the wings to their backs and arms, creating a connection that was secure but allowed for movement. He tested the balance, checked every joint, examined every feather attachment. Everything had to be perfect. Finally, on a clear morning when the guards were changing shifts and the tower was relatively unwatched, Daedalus decided it was time. He helped Icarus into his harness, adjusted the straps, made sure everything fit properly. The wings spread out from the boy's back like a magnificent cape, the feathers catching the light, looking almost alive. Then Daedalus put on his own wings, feeling their weight settling across his shoulders, extending his arms to feel how the wing surfaces moved. They felt fragile and powerful at once, like holding onto something that might transform him or destroy him, depending on 1,000 tiny factors beyond his control. Before they climbed to the tower's edge, before they launched themselves into the open air, Daedalus grabbed his son's shoulders and looked him in the eyes. This was the crucial moment, the father's wisdom that needed to be passed to the son. What he said next would be remembered for millennia, would become one of the most famous warnings in all of mythology. "Listen to me carefully, Icarus," Daedalus said, his voice serious, almost pleading. "When we fly, you must stay at the middle height. Not too low, or the sea spray and dampness will wet the feathers and make the wings too heavy, not too high, or the sun will melt the wax holding the feathers together. Follow me closely. Don't try to go your own way. Stay at the middle height, and we'll make it to freedom together." Icarus nodded, seeing the fear and love in his father's eyes, understanding that this was important, that these instructions needed to be followed exactly. "I understand, Father," he said. "I'll follow you. I'll stay at the middle height." Daedalus wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his son would remember, would be cautious, would follow instructions. But he also knew his son, knew the boy's enthusiasm, his tendency to get caught up in excitement, his youth that sometimes mistook warnings for suggestions. But there was no more time for doubts. The moment had come. Together, father and son climbed to the highest point of the tower, spread their artificial wings, looked out at the open air before them, and prepared to attempt the impossible. The leap from the tower required a faith that seemed almost religious in its intensity. Daedalus went first, running to the edge and throwing himself into the void, his wings spread wide. For a heart-stopping moment he fell, and then, miraculously, wonderfully, he caught the air. The wings held, they worked. He was flying. He felt the wind catch beneath his wings, felt himself rising on an updraft, felt the incredible, impossible sensation of being airborne. All his calculations, all his measurements, all his careful observations of birds had paid off. He had done it. He had actually done it. Humans could fly. Behind him, after a moment of terrified hesitation, Icarus followed. The boy ran to the edge, launched himself into space, felt the moment of freefall, and then his wings caught the air as well. He was flying, actually flying. The ground dropped away below him, the tower fell behind, and he was soaring through the sky like a bird, like a god, like something more than human. The initial terror gave way to exhilaration. They were doing it. They were escaping. Below them they could see the palace of Minos growing smaller, the island of Crete spreading out in all its complexity. Harbors and farms, mountains and cities, the whole kingdom that had been their prison now laid out beneath them like a map. Some people on the ground saw them. Shepherds looked up from their flocks and stared in astonishment at the two figures flying overhead. Farmers dropped their tools to watch the impossible sight. A fisherman nearly fell out of his boat, convinced he was seeing gods or demons. Unable to comprehend that humans could have mastered flight, Daedalus flew steadily, working to maintain the middle height he had told his son about. Not too close to the waves, where the sea spray might dampen his wings. Not too high, where the sun's heat would threaten the wax. He kept checking behind him to make sure Icarus was following, kept calling encouragement, kept demonstrating the proper technique. For a while, Icarus followed his father's instructions perfectly. He matched Daedalus's altitude, stayed close behind, flew with appropriate caution. He was still euphoric. How could he not be? But he was being careful, remembering his father's warnings, understanding that their lives depended on following the rules. But as the minutes passed and Crete fell further behind them, as the flying became more familiar and less terrifying, Icarus's natural exuberance began to reassert itself. This was incredible. He was flying. He could go anywhere, do anything. The sky was open before him, infinite with possibility. He began to experiment. He banked to the left, testing how his wings responded. He dove a little, feeling the rush of air as his speed increased. He climbed a bit, watching the ground fall further away. Each maneuver was successful. Each movement proved that he was mastering this new skill, that he was not just following his father, but becoming a true flyer in his own right. Daedalus noticed his son's movements and called out warnings. "Stay at the middle height. Don't experiment. Just follow me." But his voice was growing fainter as the wind carried it away, and Icarus was growing more confident, more caught up in the sheer joy of flight. The boy looked up at the sun, hanging brilliant in the sky above him. Up there, that's where the gods lived. Up there was Olympus, the realm of the divine, the heights that mortals were never supposed to reach. But he was flying now. He had transcended normal human limitations. Why should he stay at the middle height when there was so much more to explore? He began to climb. Daedalus saw what was happening and felt ice form in his chest despite the warm Mediterranean sun. "Icarus, no, stay down. Remember what I told you," he called out desperately, his voice cracking with fear. But Icarus either didn't hear or chose not to listen. The boy was ascending, rising higher and higher, chasing some combination of curiosity and ambition, and the simple joy of upward movement. The ground fell away below him until it looked like a painting, distant and abstract. The air grew thinner, colder, but also intoxicating. He was higher than any human had ever been, was approaching the realm of the gods themselves. This was what it meant to be truly alive, to push boundaries, to ignore limitations. His father had always been so cautious, so careful, so bound by rules and warnings. But Icarus was young and bold, and he was flying. He would show his father what was possible when you refused to be constrained by fear. Higher and higher he climbed, drunk on altitude and achievement, feeling invincible, feeling like he could touch the sun itself if he just stretched a little further. And then he noticed that his wings felt strange. They were responding more sluggishly, not catching the air quite as crisply as before. He looked at his wings and felt his euphoria turn instantly to horror. The feathers were coming loose. The wax that held them was softening, melting in the intense heat of the upper atmosphere, exposed too long to the sun's direct rays. Even as he watched, feathers began to drift away from his wings, floating down toward the sea like falling leaves. For a moment, Icarus hung suspended, still supported by what remained of his wings, his mind struggling to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. He was flying. He had mastered flight. This wasn't supposed to happen. But the feathers kept falling, one by one at first, then in clusters, then in a constant stream. The carefully constructed wings that had taken his father months to build were disintegrating, the wax melting, the structure failing, the whole magnificent achievement coming apart in the intense heat he had been explicitly warned to avoid. Icarus tried to descend, tried to glide down to where the air was cooler and the sun's heat less intense, but he had climbed too high. He had pushed too far. The damage was already done, and the process was accelerating. Whole sections of his wings were now bare, just wooden struts without the feathers that gave them lift and control. He began to fall. At first, it was almost gentle, a gradual sinking as his damaged wings lost their ability to keep him aloft. But as more feathers broke free, as the wing structure collapsed further, the descent became a plummet. The boy who moments ago had been soaring like a god was now falling like a stone, his remaining feathers whipping around him uselessly, the harness still strapped to his back, but now a useless weight rather than a means of flight. Daedalus saw it all. He had been climbing desperately, trying to reach his son, calling out warnings that went unheeded. Now he watched in absolute horror as Icarus fell past him, tumbling through the air, arms outstretched as if he could somehow catch himself, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. The father dove after his son, folding his wings to increase his speed, reaching out desperately even though he knew it was futile. Knew that even if he could catch up, he had no way to support the additional weight. Knew that touching would likely bring them both down. But still, he tried, because what father wouldn't? Still he dove, chasing his falling son. crying out his name even as he knew it was hopeless. But he couldn't reach him, couldn't catch him, could only watch as Icarus plummeted down and down, past the middle height where he should have stayed, past the level where the wings would have worked safely, down toward the wine-dark sea that stretched below them. The impact, when it came, was violent and final. Icarus struck the water with tremendous force, the Mediterranean swallowing him in an instant. His body, if he had somehow survived the fall, which seemed impossible, would have been knocked unconscious by the impact and would have sunk beneath the waves before he could even think of swimming. Daedalus circled above, searching desperately for any sign of his son. He saw a few loose feathers floating on the surface, saw ripples spreading out from where Icarus had struck, but nothing else. No body rising to the surface, no hand reaching for help, no miracle salvation. Just empty water, indifferent to the tragedy it had witnessed, moving in its eternal rhythms as if nothing had happened, as if the greatest achievement of human ingenuity and the life of a young man hadn't just ended in its depths. Daedalus landed as carefully as he could manage on a nearby rocky outcrop, his own wings barely functional now, as shock and grief made his movements clumsy. He tore off his wings, those instruments of triumph and tragedy, and collapsed on the stone, calling his son's name over and over, hoping against hope for an answer that would never come. The sea where Icarus fell would later be called the Icarian Sea in his memory. Islands in the area would bear names connected to his story, but these nominal honors meant nothing to Daedalus, who had lost his son, who had achieved the impossible only to have it turn immediately into catastrophe. He had warned Icarus. He had told him explicitly what would happen if he flew too high, but Icarus had been young and excited and drunk on his newfound ability, and youth so often believes itself immune to consequences, invincible in the face of warnings, capable of succeeding where others have failed simply through confidence and willpower. And so, the boy who flew too close to the sun had fallen into the sea, victim not of his father's invention, but of his own inability to follow wisdom, to respect limitations, to understand that some boundaries exist for reasons. Daedalus would eventually continue his flight to Sicily, where he would find refuge with King Icarus and live out the rest of his days, but he would never build again with the same passion, never create with the same pride. The greatest inventor of his age had lost his son to his own creation, had traded his freedom for his child's life, had learned in the worst possible way that every innovation carries risks, that every achievement has costs, that some prices are simply too high to pay. The story of Icarus spread quickly through the ancient world, growing in the telling as all stories do, accumulating meanings and morals, becoming less about the specific tragedy of one boy's death and more about universal human truths. To some, it was a clear cautionary tale about the dangers of disobedience. Icarus had been given explicit instructions by his father: stay at the middle height, don't fly too high, don't fly too low. He had ignored these warnings, had let his excitement override his judgment, and had paid the ultimate price. The lesson was simple: listen to your elders, follow instructions, respect the wisdom of those who know better than you. To others, it was a warning about hubris, that Greek concept of excessive pride, of thinking yourself equal or superior to the gods, of reaching beyond your proper station. Icarus had flown toward the sun, had approached the realm of the divine, had acted as if he was something more than a mortal boy. The gods, or simply the natural order of things, had struck him down for his presumption. Know your place, the story seemed to say. Accept your limitations. But there were other interpretations, more sympathetic to Icarus. Some saw in his flight not foolishness, but the natural exuberance of youth, the desire to push boundaries and test limits that every young person feels. Yes, he had flown too high, but wasn't that preferable to never flying at all? Wasn't there something admirable about his willingness to risk everything for a moment of transcendence, for the chance to see what lay beyond the safe middle ground his father prescribed? The Roman poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, described Icarus's flight with sympathy. Emphasizing the boy's innocence and joy, he portrayed Icarus not as foolishly disobedient, but as understandably caught up in wonder, unable to resist the temptation of altitude when the sky lay open before him. In Ovid's telling, the tragedy was not that Icarus was wicked or stupid, but simply that he was young, and youth doesn't always have the perspective to understand that consequences are real. Artists throughout the centuries would return to Icarus's story again and again. Painters depicted the moment of his fall. Peter Bruegel, the elder, famously showed the tragedy occurring in the background of a mundane farm scene, suggesting that even the most dramatic personal disasters pass unnoticed by a world absorbed in its own concerns. Sculptors captured him at various moments, preparing for flight, soaring in triumph, falling in despair. Writers used his story as a metaphor for everything from scientific ambition to romantic passion to political overreach. Icarus became a symbol, an archetype, a shorthand for a particular kind of tragedy. The gifted youth who flies too close to his dreams and is destroyed by them, but perhaps the most interesting interpretations came from those who questioned the traditional moral entirely. What if, they asked, Daedalus was the one at fault? What if the real lesson wasn't about Icarus's disobedience, but about the father who created a dangerous technology and gave it to his son without adequate testing, training, or safety measures? After all, Daedalus had built wings that would fail under certain common conditions. Too much heat, too much moisture. He had created a device with a narrow operational window, and then expected a young, inexperienced, excited boy to maintain perfect discipline while using it for the first time. Was it really surprising that Icarus made a mistake? Was it really the boy's fault that his father's invention had such critical vulnerabilities? And what about Daedalus's own crimes? He had murdered his nephew out of professional jealousy, had created the labyrinth that imprisoned and killed countless Athenian youths, had served a tyrant in exchange for protection and comfort. Was his loss of Icarus perhaps not a random tragedy, but a form of cosmic justice, a punishment for his own sins? These darker readings of the myth suggested that the story was less about a foolish boy ignoring wise warnings and more about how the sins of parents are visited upon children, how the ambitious creations of genius often destroy the innocent, how progress and innovation frequently exact terrible human costs. Modern retellings have taken the ambiguity even further. Some portray Icarus as aware of the risks and choosing to fly high anyway, making a conscious decision that a brief moment of transcendence is worth the price of death. In these versions, he's not foolish, but heroic, choosing quality of experience over quantity of years, refusing to be constrained by fear even when the constraints are rational. Others have asked, did Icarus actually die? Or did he survive the fall and wash up on some distant shore, living out his life in anonymity, forever marked by his failed flight? Did he escape his father's shadow only to be remembered forever as a cautionary tale rather than as a person in his own right? The myth has been used to critique technology, to warn against scientific overreach, to question whether humans should pursue every capability they can imagine. If we can do something, Does that mean we should? If we can create artificial wings, should we fly? If we can split atoms, should we build bombs? If we can manipulate genes, should we redesign life itself? Icarus's fall has been invoked in debates about everything from space exploration to artificial intelligence, a timeless reminder that innovation without wisdom is dangerous. In the end, perhaps what makes the story of Icarus so enduring is its ambiguity. Unlike many myths with clear moral lessons, this one resists simple interpretation. Was Icarus foolish or brave? Was his flight a triumph or a tragedy? Should we celebrate his brief moment of transcendence or condemn his fatal disobedience? The answer, like most important answers, is probably both. Icarus was young and inexperienced and too confident in his abilities. He ignored good advice and paid a terrible price. But he also experienced something that no human before him had experienced, saw the world from a perspective that had been reserved for gods and birds, had a moment of absolute freedom and joy before his fall. There's a reason we remember his name, but not the names of the countless others who stayed safely on the ground, who never attempted flight, who lived long, boring lives and died in their beds surrounded by unimpressed descendants. Icarus, for all his foolishness, did something worth remembering. He reached for the impossible and almost grasped it. He failed spectacularly, dramatically, tragically, but at least he tried. Daedalus, for his part, succeeded in his escape, but lost everything that mattered in the process. He created a miracle and watched it kill his son. He achieved the impossible and found that the achievement was hollow without someone to share it with. His success was, in the most profound sense, a failure. The myth asks us to consider what we're willing to risk for our dreams, what price we're willing to pay for transcendence, whether caution or ambition should guide our choices. It asks whether it's better to fly briefly and fall or never to fly at all. It asks whether parents should protect their children from all risks or teach them to navigate danger themselves. And it reminds us always that the sun is hot, that wax melts, that some heights are dangerous to reach, and that warnings exist for reasons, even if, in our enthusiasm and confidence, we choose not to heed them. In art galleries and museums around the world, images of Icarus still appear, falling, flying, frozen at the moment between triumph and tragedy. His wings spread wide, feathers drifting away, the sun blazing above him, the sea waiting below. He's forever young, forever confident, forever in that instant before the consequences arrive, and perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps that's exactly what the myth has always been about. The moment of possibility, the instant when anything seems achievable, before reality reasserts itself, before gravity reminds us of our limitations, before we learn, as we all must learn eventually, that some rules cannot be broken, some limits cannot be transcended, and some prices are paid in full. Regardless of our intentions or our genius, Icarus flew too close to the sun. His wings melted. He fell into the sea and drowned. These are the facts, stark and unavoidable. But the meaning of those facts, whether they represent a cautionary tale or an inspiration, a warning or an encouragement, a tragedy or a triumph, that meaning remains open, changing with each generation, each reader, each person who looks at the myth and sees something of themselves in the boy, who ignored his father's warnings and reached for the impossible. For some, Icarus is a fool, punished for arrogance. For others, he is a hero, proof that the human spirit was never meant to crawl, but to soar. Between those two visions lies the truth of every dreamer, that flight and fall are bound together, that to rise toward the sun is to risk the sea below. And yet, centuries later, his name still shines. not as a lesson in failure, but as a testament to the fire that drives us to try, even knowing we might fall.